Well, all right, everyone. Welcome back to the Psych and Theo podcast. Tim and I have an exciting topic that we're going to be discussing today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for for supporting the podcast. We love hearing comments, at least every week. And we have some.
It's growing too. People are sharing it, and I keep getting texts or phone calls from people saying, "Hey, we just listened to the podcast. I thought it was great." They're like, "Sam's awesome. Tim, you got a lot to work on."
We're working towards this together. We've been feeling really encouraged by your guys' comments and reviews. So please keep doing that. We really do appreciate it. And so, Tim, what are we discussing today? I think we're discussing not only a trending topic, and fortunately and unfortunately, it's hitting someone that I have esteemed for years. But in this area, I actually disagree on many points.
Yeah. So before we get into the series on spiritual warfare and demonic possession, which will come right after this episode, today we're going to be talking about the controversy surrounding John MacArthur and the PTSD comments that he has made at a conference, and then just on some shows later,
and on mental health stuff.
Yeah. So it's generally a comment on mental health, and I think what sparked it was saying things about PTSD and ADHD and things like that. So it caused a lot of controversy, a lot of stirring of the pot, let's say, on social media. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is because people are kind of at each other's throats now. Christians are at each other's throats, arguing over this topic of whether aspects of mental health are really mental health, whether they're physiological or physically based, and not just spiritual. And that's the controversy around his comments. So we'll play the comments, and then we'll take it apart, since I do theology and you do mental health. So I think we are qualified to actually talk about this one.
This one's going to be good.
Yeah. I see a lot of people commentating on it, and it's really poor commentators. It's just really not good analysis, either because they have a vested interest in defending something that we disagree with, we think is wrong, or they're just not going deep enough to discuss the substance of the issue. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no pun intended with substance.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay. All right, so let's get into it. So those of you who may not be familiar with this, if you're not on social media a lot, you might not have seen these clips, but essentially John MacArthur, he was at a conference several weeks ago where he was posed a question about mental health, and he made a comment about essentially PTSD and ADHD and some other mental health symptoms or conditions not being real. So we're going to play the initial clip for you, and then he follows it up with some other things. So we'll play the initial clip, and then we'll go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There's no such thing as PTSD. There's no such thing as OCD. There's no such thing as ADHD. Those are noble lies to basically give the excuse to, in the end of the day, to medicate people.
Okay, so that was his original comment, and that's what stirred up all of the controversy, was saying PTSD is not real, ADHD is not real, and saying these things are really grief and other things. And that really sparked a lot of outrage, I guess, on Twitter and other things. But then it also, people started circling the wagons, people who wanted to defend John MacArthur and say, well, either he wasn't really saying that, or he definitely was saying that, and he's right and everyone else is wrong. So John MacArthur later clarified his comments on a few shows. We have a clip from the Ally Beth Stuckey show where he makes a few more comments on this issue to clarify what he means. So we'll go ahead and play that as well.
What I was saying was, is there post-traumatic stress? Of course. Is it a brain syndrome? No. PTSD is really grief, survival guilt. It's having watched your buddies blown to pieces. You got to deal with that grief. But putting a chemical into your body that will alter your brain, there's no way to define people's difficulty in dealing with the issues of life as a brain problem. It's a mind problem. If you want to solve your mind problem, you've got to find love, joy, peace, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, self-control. Those are spiritual virtues that are available in Christ. Don't turn to chemicals, turn to Christ.
So a lot to say on these two clips.
Yeah. So let's unpack some of this.
Yeah.
Okay. So you are the mental health expert here between the two of us.
Yeah.
So let's start by saying this. Both of us hold John MacArthur in high regard. Both of us, I think, really highly respect him. I think both of us, in our own, respects, theology and in mental health counseling, we are grateful for John MacArthur and his ministry and things that he's done. I even said this on Twitter, when this all came out, that I'm really appreciative of John MacArthur. He's shown a lot of courage in a lot of areas, especially during the COVID era, when so many churches were shutting down and so many pastors were capitulating to the whims of the quote unquote the science of the day. And if anyone in our audience is going to get mad at me for that, well, we'll take that up later. Yeah, I wrote some papers on that one. So but John MacArthur took a stand there. He's been a voice of moral courage through the decades in our culture. Okay. So we're both really, really indebted to his ministry, to his writings, his commentaries and other things. I mean, his commentaries are one of the ones that I go to sometimes when I do Bible studies. I typically will get one of his commentaries along with some exegetical and scholarly commentaries. I just like the way that you can tell he writes as a pastor. And so I like the way he writes. So I really am appreciative of a lot of things that he does, but that does not mean that I or you or anyone else has to defend a statement, a very public statement, that we believe is wrong, and not just wrong, but it's always harmful.
Yeah, very harmful.
Yeah. So that's where we're coming from. Is that we're not some liberals, trying to like bash John MacArthur or something, or progressives. We're essentially sort of in the same camp, and but we're coming at this from a different angle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so where do you want to get? Take it from the top. Where do you want to go?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, and thank you for hitting on all those different points about, our respect and esteem for MacArthur. Definitely been an influential voice in my life as well, especially growing up with my dad as well. But yeah, I mean, once I started hearing MacArthur comments on these on the topic of mental health, I always felt that there was something that doesn't sound right. There was this over spiritualization of this mental health crisis that I felt he wasn't really either understanding of, or he was just trying to re-emphasize in the culture that scripture should always supersede everything else. And if you have enough scripture, then that should heal a lot of these other areas, because we were talking a little bit about just how we view humanity and the fallenness of man. Part of it is that we fail in these different areas of our lives, and the mind is one of them. But when it comes to mental health, probably the first one I'm going to trace back just a little bit so I could jump into this specific statement, is he was talking about depression. And one of the things that he was telling, he was answering a question from an interviewer, and they asked him, well, what do you think about depression? Is it a real thing? He's like, it's not a real thing. It's an overemphasis on all your problems, and that's all it is, right? But depression, the reason why people push so much against depression or anxiety, or at least I've seen a lot with MacArthur, is that because there's some very specific scripture verses that seem to address anxiety and seem to address depression very specifically. So the assumption is that you're doing something wrong if you're not able to overcome that, right? Because it's right there in the Bible. And we are not denying anything that the scriptures teach. What we always look at is, what does the process look like? So from a mental health perspective, the point makes sense, but there's a process to healing. Like, no one just heals like that. Now, we've heard many different testimonies where people have, they became saved, or they pray to God and they have these miraculous healings, but that's not everyone. And I think we fail to realize that not everyone experiences that type of healing. For many, it's long-term. For many, they don't experience any healing at all. They kind of endure it and go through that whole process. But when we think about the generations, the older generation, Tim, and correct me if I'm wrong with this, the older generation seems to have more of an emphasis on this. Like, you got to tough it out. You got to push through. This is just something that you're not having enough faith in. Right. The younger generation is almost on the flip side, where everything is a problem. and nothing can be solved. It can't be, it's not scripture, it's not this, it's not even going to a counselor. Like everything's a problem for them. So you have these two different cultures in the same environment, and they're pushing against each other, right? One is saying you're not having enough faith. The other one is saying, well, faith is not the only thing that's relevant here. So all that to say, what we're at this crossroad here where, okay, what did John MacArthur say in regards to mental health? He's saying it's not a real issue. And what we're saying is that what mental health is, it's a reflection of the fallenness of man in all these different areas, as we talk about in counseling, bio, psycho, social, spiritual, right? And all of them impact each other. So if there's something wrong with one area, it could influence one's spiritual state, one's emotional state, one's mental state. So I think that's where I can place a little foundation for our topic today, is that his statement on mental illness, it's wrong, it's flawed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that right now. But what were your thoughts about it, just as you heard him comment on that? For me, it was immediately, you're wrong, because you're not really addressing the mental health issue. You're just looking at it from one perspective, which is the spiritual part, but that's not really what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So my gut reaction was this, and I said, when I first heard the clip, I'm like, oh, this is just demonstrably wrong. Like, and I kind of put my head in my hand, or my face, face palm kind of things, because, I like John MacArthur, and I just don't want to see, in the tail end of his ministry, I don't want to see him making these kind of comments where it's like, it's just provably wrong, scientifically provably wrong. What I mean by that is, I think he's made an oversimplification, and this speaks to some of the older mindsets within evangelicalism of simplifying this between there are brain problems and then there are mind problems, and brain problems are essentially, that is by their nature, physical. And then mind problems are essentially spiritual, and there's no overlap between the two. Those two tracks don't cross. Okay. That itself is an oversimplification of human physiology and what we know now from mental health. It's unfortunate because, modern research in mental health has uncovered all of these connections, especially in the research of neuroplasticity, how the mind and the brain work together. They can work together. They affect one another.
Especially with trauma, PTSD.
Yeah. So MacArthur seems to be in complete denial of that, or unaware of it, or just intentionally downplaying it or ignoring it, of that relationship between the symbiotic relationship between mind and body. This is something that is really not new. I mean, you can find mental health or attempts to treat mental health even in ancient literature. Now, of course, they didn't understand everything that we do, but there were attempts to treat mental health. There were attempts to treat it through chemicals, because hallucinogenics and other things have been used by human beings for thousands of years. Maybe we should do a thing on psychotropics sometime.
Oh, you should see.
We should do a series on that.
I went to a conference last year that was really emphasizing that a lot, and for PTSD specifically.
Yeah, like MDMA.
And it was, it felt uncomfortable. It was interesting.
Oh man,
though.
we gotta do it. Yeah, and I know the perfect guest that we can bring on if we bring it. Yeah. I won't drop his name because I don't want to put pressure on him. Right. He'll be like, why are you mentioning me in your podcast? You haven't even talked to me.
You haven't even talked to me.
Yeah. Okay. So, but yeah, here's an example. Asclepius. So there's an ancient doctor named Asclepius, who, sorry, I'm getting that wrong. Asclepius is actually the Greek god. Who am I thinking of? Galen, Galen. He's a Greco-Roman physician living in the 1st and 2nd century AD. If I remember that correctly. So he was famous because he lived and worked at a little town called Asclepion, which is named after the Greek god Asclepius. This sits at the foot of the Acropolis of Pergamum. The church Pergamum in the seven churches of Revelation. Yeah. So the church of Pergamum is in Turkey, and there's multiple sections of this ancient city. The Acropolis sits on top of a hill. That's where most of these ancient cities would have an Acropolis. It's where you would that's where all the important buildings were. It's where you would run to, if you got invaded, everyone would go up there to the top of the mountain. Well, at the foot of the mountain is a little town called Asclepion, named after the Greek god Asclepius. And Asclepius was the god of many things, but among those being like medicine and healing. And Galen, he operated there, he worked there, and there were, if you go to that site, I've been there twice, there's an ancient hospital that's there. And there's an underground tunnel that you can go and sit in. And it was for patients who were experiencing like mental illness. You would go in this sort of a picture like not a deep underground tunnel, like something that's been dug out and then buried again, like a tunnel that's been made. Almost like when you're on the playground, you crawl through the corrugated pipe tunnels, and you're like, think it's so cool.
Yeah.
So picture that, but bigger and made of stone. And people would go down in there and they would sit in this tunnel, and in between them, like as they would sit on one side or the other of the tunnel, in between them was this little bitty stream of water that would run through and create that like trickle water sound. And then on the top of the tunnel were these holes that were dug through, where you could actually stand on top of the tunnel, which you'd be like standing on ground basically, and you could speak down into the holes to the other people. And so there were these people that would work for this hospital that would speak encouraging things down into the hole to these patients who were sitting down in this tunnel in the cool, damp, dark area listening to water. And these two things were meant to kind of put them in an environment that was relaxing and soothing and help them to work through kind of their mental states. Yeah. So anyway, that's just an example of, even in ancient times, trying to treat people with mental illness. So where was I going with that? Yeah, like the oversimplification that, well, brain problems are just physical, mind problems are spiritual, and neither the two shall meet. That's an oversimplification. And it seems that from MacArthur's comments, that's what he believes. Yeah. Now, maybe that's not what he believes, but it seems I think that is the logical implication of the comments that we listen to.
Yeah, that's what I think from it.
Yeah, it's an oversimplification. So, and he says things like, if you want to solve mind problems, you need to essentially treat spiritual conditions. And I think that's a either or fallacy. That when it comes to mental health is what follows from his comments is, there's problem when it comes to mental health. It's a purely mind problem. And so you can either treat it with spiritual renewal or with chemical treatment. So those are your two options if you have a mental health problem. This seems to be what he is saying. Yeah. Is that you have a mental health problem, it's essentially spiritual. So, and you have two options. You can choose a spiritual renewal route, or you can choose the chemical treatment route. But the chemical treatment is only going to treat the physical brain, which won't touch the mind. So I think that the division that he's making here is invalid on many fronts.
Very much so. Yeah. And Tim, that was honestly when I came to grad school for studying my counseling degree. That was one of the hardest things for me to overcome, because I was taught and it was ingrained in my mind so much that medication was just a substitute for excusing bad behavior, right? Meaning that people are taking medication in order to control certain impulses or to heal some things. And it was saying, well, if I don't get this medication, then I'm justified in doing this bad behavior, whatever the behavior might have been. So I think from MacArthur's perspective, and even the reference that he cited, he said one of the psychiatrists was from like the 1950s. So even at that time, they don't have the information that we have accessible to us today. And there's obviously been a lot of research, and you mentioned neuroplasticity and so on. So we see the changes that happen in the brain when someone goes through trauma. Very highly activated regions, and some of the regions of the brain completely shut off. All those are impact of the brain. And you can see that from people who have experienced war, sexual abuse, prostitution, all of these different things, sexual trafficking, So all of these different areas that just have to shut down certain parts of the brain because it's too much. The brain can't take all of that information. The only way, remember, I think we talked about this in one of our episodes, that the only way that the brain can continue to function is to completely disregard some piece of information so that it can continue to live, right? It's looking for survival.
Yeah. And that would be like a dissociative.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
thing?
Easily.
Yeah.
Like you see people who have gone through traumatic experiences in session. You can see them when you're talking about that issue, whatever it might have been. It could be war. It could be seeing their buddy be destroyed. There was a bomb or whatever the case is, or rape, anything like that. Like you can see it in their face. They just completely daze off. And it's like, you have to find a way to get them back into the session. But it makes perfect sense. The body has just learned to respond like that to be safe. Or they'll be hypervigilant and be too aroused to not even focus on what's going on in the session. So we go back to his point about PTSD not being a real thing. Obviously, it is a real thing, and it does impact the brain, and the brain also influences the mind. Now, we were talking a little bit before.
Can I pause you?
Yeah.
Right. So when he says PTSD is not real in that initial comment, and then he comes back later and he says it is real, but it's like grief. So it's like it's an emotional state, not like, so when he's saying it's not real in the sense that there's a physical connection there.
Right.
But
right.
You're saying that's incorrect.
That's incorrect. It's because grief is only emotional. But one of the things that we know about trauma is that it's actually more physical, right? Because your body is meant to respond in ways to protect you, right? So that could be shutting down parts of your brain. It could be just being frozen, right? There's the flight, freeze, and what's the word? Fight, flight, freeze. So people just respond differently. I know of people who are in very dangerous situations and they wanted to respond, but their body just froze. Afterwards, you speak to them and they say, why didn't I do anything? And they feel so much shame that they couldn't do anything in that moment. But your body's way of being safe was just to freeze. So that's just how your body responded. You have no mental power over that. Your body just froze, right? And for some people, they naturally fight. For others, they run away, right? It's, again, the body is just looking for natural instincts to respond to those dangerous situations.
Yeah, I remember an instance that freeze mechanism you talked about, because most people just know fight or flight, but freeze is a real thing, because I know a friend of mine who he had experienced abuse, growing up as a child, and then he found himself in a situation later as an adult where let's just say a partner was making moves on him, let's say, like making sexual advances that he wasn't comfortable with. And this was a female, a woman, he's a man, and he's a strong guy. He was a cop, but she started kind of making these sexual advances, and he wasn't comfortable with that. But his body immediately went back to the times where he was abused, and his body shut down and he froze. Yeah. And then she basically assaulted him, sexually, because he couldn't move. Yeah. And he felt great shame for that. He felt great embarrassment, because here he is, this big, strong law enforcement guy. Like, why couldn't he? He's like, no one's going to believe me, Right. Because why couldn't I, overpower this little bitty lady,
And shame reinforces that trauma, right? That aspect of shame just reinforces that belief. Now you can't share with anyone. Yeah. And again, it's just that constant belief and the way that your body feels throughout that. Yeah. So we're not talking about only something that is spiritual. I mean, it's all of it. Imagine. Yeah. So think about these layers right here. Think about this, and this has happened a lot in the last couple of years. Think about someone in leadership in the church that sexually abused you as a child, or abused someone as a child. That person grows up seeing that person be leader, pastor, whatever the case is, talking about the love of God, talking about the grace of God, talking about the forgiveness of God, talking about the goodness of God. And this person who was abused by that person, or the victim who was abused by that person, they grow up. So not only was their trauma physical, not only was it emotional, not only was it mental, trying to make connections out of, he's there, I'm here, he's a leader, I'm not, there's a power differential there. And then lastly, spiritual, what that made them believe about God. So all of those layers in the traumatic experience it makes perfect sense how they would influence one another. And it seems like MacArthur tries to separate one from the other, right? He's saying that, no, it's only emotional, or it's only physical, or it's only mental, whatever the case is. And it's not. They're all intertwined. And I think that's something that's important for our audience to know.
Yeah. So I'm going to just devil's advocate, if I can push back. So you're saying, well, a trauma, that someone's reacting to trauma that they've experienced, let's say someone who's defending MacArthur will say, well, that's just unprocessed grief. Mm-hmm. Okay. What's going on in the brain when someone experiences trauma that produces PTSD or something else? Like, what's going on in the brain when that happens? Like, what's the physical event?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the best illustration I can give is thinking of boxing or MMA, right? So one of the things that an argument that was being made for MMA, you can win a lot of different ways in MMA. You can knock someone out, you can submit them, you can go all 5 rounds and you win the decision, whatever the case is, right? So you're not always getting hit in the head. You're getting hit in the body, you're being taken down. So the head is not receiving as many hits as it would in boxing. Boxing, all the shots are body shots or they're in the head, right? So the argument was, because in boxing you're getting more hit in the head, you're going to experience more trauma because of all those hits. Boom, boom, right? It shakes the brain. With MMA, you're not always losing that same way. You could just be taken down and get submitted. So when we think about trauma, think about it that way. Is it one big shot, one big traumatic event that has changed the way that you live your life, essentially, right? It could just be one. And for some people, they've experienced one traumatic event and they'll say to another person, well, I experienced something similar to you, but I'm not being or feeling the same way that you are. But remember, the factor is not just the experience itself. One of the supporting factors for dealing better with trauma is the support system. So imagine 2 people, exact same thing. Let's say it's child abuse. And again, this is a very sensitive topic and we don't know who of our audience has experienced these things, but I think that's an example that we can apply here. So 2 people who have experienced child abuse, that interpretation in their mind sets up the stage for how they're going to live out the rest of their lives, right? The messages that they have, how their body felt throughout that moment, who the person was. Typically, it's someone who's related in some way, shape, or form to the victim. Sometimes a family member, a close friend, right? So all of these factors are playing a role in how this person is going to experience the rest of their lives, right? But the buffer to all of that is what kind of social support system do they have there? Do they have someone that they can share that with, right? So you asked about what's happening in the brain. Well, messaging is one, right? 2 is, where are the memories being stored, right? Because if it was such a significant form of abuse, then the mind's not going to want to keep or retain all of the details of that. Smell, sight, right? Sounds, all of those things, the mind doesn't want to remember all of that. So to feel safe, which is what the body wants, it's going to exclude certain details from that process. So the mind is being shaped by this consistent message of, I'm dirty, I'm not worth it, I'm good for nothing, who's going to want me, like all of these different messages. So it's changing the narrative is one way which I would say is changing the narrative of how the person views themselves. And there's always a lot of shame attached to trauma. So
can I ask a clarifying question? So the brain is wanting to keep the body safe.
Yes.
And because of that, the brain is creating messages that the mind receives that says, so the brain is saying, don't do that thing because you'll feel dirty, you'll feel shameful or whatever. And it could be a good, healthy thing. Like, let's say, like getting married and having a sexual relationship with your spouse. The brain is saying, don't do that because it's similar to this abuse that you experienced.
Yeah.
And so it's telling the mind those things. So the mind creates this narrative of, I'm not going to do this. I'm shame, I'm dirty and all that, and avoids otherwise healthy behavior.
Yeah. I mean, a good example of that is, one of our professors, he's a sex therapist and works with a lot of couples. And he was talking about how he was counseling a couple doing their premarital. The girl had experienced sexual abuse from a family member when she was a child. She never shared that with her future husband. They get married, and then when they started to have sex, she started to get all of these feelings of trauma from her past, but she thought they was gone, but she had never experienced that again. So basically her body was remembering what she experienced when she was a child, and her husband at the time now was the recipient of that emotional response. She thought it was done with, right? Because it hadn't happened again. It was a one-time event, but her body wasn't feeling the same thing that she was feeling now as a married woman. So the body remembers things. There's a really good book, actually. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. It's by Bessel van der Kolk. Yeah, most counselors or students in counseling, they're going to know it. But if you don't, if you're not in counseling, that's a really good book that talks about how the body remembers those things. So again, going back to safety, is that whatever they were doing in their sexual relationship with her husband, it didn't feel safe. So now the body starts pulling back, starts responding in ways that she wouldn't want to. Now she feels shame because now she can't please her husband. Her husband feels ashamed because I'm hurting my wife and I don't even know why. Like, what am I doing? Right. So the body is where a lot of that information is stored. Sometimes we just don't know where or what's going to be the trigger for it. A lot of people think that they've healed from their trauma, but they've just been living their life without any triggers until they meet someone. And that's typically what happens. When you start getting close to other people, that's when those triggers start to come up a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me ask you another question then. Let's talk about one thing briefly, just so
Is that clear, by the way?
Okay. I think so. Yeah. Neuroplasticity, for those who may not be familiar with that term, I threw it out there earlier in the episode.
Good.
So just briefly explain neuroplasticity. How does that work? Because I think we're kind of talking around that a little bit. I should ask that a little bit earlier. Like, what is neuroplasticity and how does it play into this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, neuroplasticity is basically the ability for the brain to continue to make new pathways. So new ways of thinking, new ways of feeling, new ways of experiencing different events. Sometimes that's done through exposure therapy. Like if someone was afraid of spiders per se, you wouldn't go and just throw someone in a room where there's a bunch of spiders, right? Tarantulas and so on. You do minimal exposure so you can help the brain remap, right? The way that it perceives a certain situation, right? So if I'm in here and I have a huge fear of spiders, but the spider's over there in the corner, I'm probably not going to feel as scared as if it was only a foot away from it, right? But I introduce myself to that experience little by little, teaching my mind, hey, I'm safe. I'm okay. I'm not in danger. Another way, I guess, to look at it is if you think about construction on a highway, right? You take the same highway every single day to work, but they're doing construction work on it. Naturally, the next day or the next couple of days, you're going to want to take that same route, but you're going to say, well, no, they're doing construction on it. I need to take a different route. So you start finding ulterior ways to get to work, or alternate ways, to get to work. And that's kind of the same idea.
And you know exactly how long each light is and all that stuff. Yeah.
You retrain your mind.
You know the old lady that's going to get in front of you
Exactly.
if you're late. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I like to talk about this in terms of like virtue ethics, because neuroplasticity it shows a real connection between the physical brain and the mind, which is an immaterial, property. Okay. And the two of them have this symbiotic relationship. The brain learns, like the mind chooses certain actions. Let's say you develop habits and the brain learns those habits and those pathways. And so your neurons start building those pathways of decision-making. But the mind can also be aware, I've developed a really bad habit here. I need to change. And it can build new pathways that way. So, there is some people will want to say, well, if you're experiencing, PTSD or something like that, you just got to work on it, with neural pathways or whatever. And there might be, I want to ask you, that's kind of where I'm going with this is, sometimes you can work on these conditions with cognitive behavioral therapy, but sometimes they're a little bit deeper than that. Like the physical side is deeper than just building new pathways.
Yes.
Exactly. Can you maybe get into that a little bit?
Yes. And I talk about this a lot when working with trauma clients. It's about maybe a quarter of my caseload is trauma clients. And the common theme, and I'm on a trauma team as well, the common theme for anyone dealing with trauma is to help the person feel safe, right? It's hard to think about new ways of thinking or implementing new messages when there's a shame message going on in the background, when the person doesn't feel safe, right? It's like, driving 70 miles per hour on the freeway, and but my car only goes 50, and trying to slow you down so that I can get to whatever it is I need to get to, so we can go at the same pace. So some people are either going to be way advanced or they're going to be way behind in regards to their trauma path, right? So what we want to do is just help the person feel safe. That's goal number one. I have to help this person feel safe. If they don't feel safe, the CBT, all the things that we're trying to do, they won't work, because the person needs to feel safe. Their body needs to feel regulated. There might be something in the other person that maybe makes me feel a little bit anxious and worried, and they can pick up on that, because people who experience trauma are typically more sensitive to subtle cues and changes in people's behavior and words about them. So they're going to pick up on all of that, and all of those things make them feel unsafe, which means that if you're trying to implement a new thought pattern, they're not going to be thinking about the new thought pattern. They might repeat it, but their body is going to be in conflict with the message. So if the message is, you're here with a counselor, you're safe, but their body is saying, no, you remind me of my ex, you remind me of my dad, you remind me of my mom, whatever the case, that's what the body is going to say, and it's going to crash with that message. So there's no progress being made in that session. People have to feel safe first.
Yeah. So let me ask you this then, because MacArthur has set this problem up as the society is over medicated. So their society is trying to treat spiritual problems with chemical treatments. My question for you, we've talked about trauma, neuroplasticity, the relationship between the brain and the mind. Is there a place for chemical treatments, let's say medication or other things, chemical treatments for something like PTSD, even if temporarily or permanently? I'm going to leave that wide open for you. Do some forms of trauma, and forgive me for being imprecise in this language, but like PTSD being like a reaction to that trauma or a response to that trauma, do some forms of that require temporary or permanent treatment, like medication?
Yeah. And it depends, right? It depends on the client, depends who the person is, depends on their support system. There's a lot of research being done on grit and perseverance, on how does a person bounce back, right? I think we did an episode on that, resilience. So there's those factors. There's the support system. There's skills that they have, disciplines. So there's so many factors involved. So some people are going to require more longer term care. Some people are going to require less. But the whole goal behind that whole process is helping the person feel safe. If they can experience safety with you as a counselor, then it's about finding other people who can kind of replicate that same type of safety for them. Right? Usually when you think about people with trauma, or anyone really, you're looking at two different emotional regulation systems, right? And if one is dysregulated, it can impact the one who's regulated, right? So if you start, dating someone, or people are in relationships, if the other person is always dysregulated, and let's say you come in and you are regulated, like you understand your emotions well and so on, this person could dysregulate you. But the same thing can happen in the opposite, where you could provide a sense of security for this person who's dysregulated, right? So relationships is really the interaction of two nervous systems, if we can look at it that way, right? And with trauma, it's especially that. We go into counseling, you're hoping that the counselor is well regulated, so that the dysregulated client can now know what it looks like to be regulated.
But can medications, is there a place for medication in treatment of PTSD, let's say?
Yes, it can definitely help. But like anything, it's only one factor out of the whole treatment process.
Yeah. Okay. So those who just want to chalk things up to medication and be dependent on medication, MacArthur has a point there that's not basically inappropriate, probably.
Yeah. And we have to be honest.
Or overly simplistic. Let's say, it's trying to treat everything with a single solution, medication. Yeah.
And for us in the counseling field, like we're frustrated, at least with Christians, obviously I work in a Christian setting. We're frustrated.
I'm frustrated with Christians. Yeah. I'm not even in the mental health space.
Yeah. I mean, there is this overemphasis on just medicating people. It's like you go to the doctor and they say, oh, you have this anxiety. Okay, let's medicate you, right? When it could be something else. It could be emotional. It could be mental. It could be physical, right? For some people, it could be as simple as their diet and exercise, right?
Yeah.
And when we talk about depression, it's that could be one of the aspects of it, right?
Yeah. So it's a good point. So to push back on MacArthur somewhat on this, he says when you use chemicals, you risk harming the brain. So he kind of sets this up as if you're trying to treat a spiritual problem with chemicals, all you're doing is risking harming the brain. So it's sort of a no-win situation here,
right? And I
with
think
using chemicals. Is that right or wrong?
Well, if he's referring to dependence, it can be. Right? Because some people do become dependent on these medications and they'd rather have, they make this pro-con list of, okay, if I take this medication, I'll have to take this for, the next 6 months to a year.
Yeah.
And I'm going to sacrifice sleep. Right? So maybe it's working to help with dealing with other people or being able to have relationships and work and function at work. But they're losing sleep or they feel just a little bit more anxious than they usually would, right? So it causes different symptoms. And that's what most people do when they take a medication. They're assessing, am I willing to deal with the side effects for it to actually help with my sleeping or to help with my anxiety or depression? For some, they hate it. Like I know a number of students who started taking medication, they just didn't like, it removed the depression, but then they felt anxious or they felt something else that they just didn't like. So they stopped taking it. They'd rather deal with that than with the side effects.
And if they come off a medication, maybe too soon or improperly, it can have
Some people
effect.
Usually what you'll see is they'll start with 10 milligrams and they'll go up to 20 and 50.
So they build a tolerance to it.
They build a tolerance for it. So they don't want that anymore.
Yeah.
But for some, they keep on doing that and the doctors are like, okay, well, this is as much as I can give you. And they just kind of plateau there.
Well, let me ask you this. Are there some mental illnesses that require medication to resolve? And I'm going to just leave it at like maybe schizophrenia or DID or something like that. We'll get into in our spiritual warfare series, but are there some mental illnesses that something has gone wrong physically in the brain that can't be corrected with CBT, let's say, or other things? It requires something else to treat this mental illness.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not being a psychiatrist and regarding.
Yeah, I'm putting you on the spot.
yeah. I mean, the only way that I could frame it is it's one element. And so it could be that. And if that works, then great. Some people just need a lifesaver. They just need to stay afloat because they've been drowning for so long. They want to have some level of survival. Yeah. Right. And when we talk about PTSD, even with depression, I mean, some people feel so deflated. They don't want to work. They start picking up addictions. They're not functional, not able to relate to anyone. So they just want anything to keep them afloat. So if that's medication, then that's what they're going to find as their solution. So there is something to what he says about us being an over-medicated culture. And the way that I also view that, it's a business. At the end of the day, people who are struggling with mental health issues, they're a market, right? And if those who are creating the medications for this can make a profit from that, they're going to use it. I mean, think about the commercials, and we actually made a joke about this in one of our sessions, not our sessions, in our meetings. Is the commercial is, hey, it will help you deal with your depression. Potential side effects could be death. Death. And they put like this happy music behind it, right?
And there's someone frolicking in the field.
Exactly.
Yeah, playing with their dog.
All that is marketing, right? Yeah. So there is that market for it, and there is money to be made from it. So we always like to, at least my own personal approach is always, okay, emotional, spiritual, mental, relational. And then if we address all of those things and there's still the same ongoing problem, then we can look at the physical aspect, which is the medication. Yeah. Okay, if we deal with all these, can we use a medication? Yeah. There are other people who come in already medicated, and you just kind of keep that going, and you're just trying to provide and supplement the other areas.
Yeah. So I think I'm not a counselor or a psychiatrist, but I think they're in the Christian community where MacArthur's views can actually produce some difficulties, let's say, for people who are trying to get mental health treatment, is if they're in a situation where medication actually could help them, even temporarily, like a friend of mine who worked for a very well-known church. He's involved in lots of ministries. He was a pastor for a time. He was dealing with, a lot of anxiety, and he temporarily, like this Christian counselor and psychiatrist, had him on a regimen of this medication that helped him. It helped his brain rewire itself, and that's how he explained it to me, was that it was something that it almost gave the brain space to relax and rewire. And that was a temporary thing. To my knowledge, he's not on it anymore. It was very short, couple months, and then he was off of it and he's good, So it seems that some people might be so resistant to medication when it actually might help them.
Right.
So I think the wisdom, or what we're trying to get at, the wisdom here is medication is just one thing. CBT is just one thing. Other treatments there's a whole regimen of things that you could try to treat mental illness, but to just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, the whole culture's over medicated. Well, this thing isn't real. Like trauma isn't, PTSD isn't real. ADHD isn't real. It's just patently false.
Yes.
I'll give you another example. And now you know more about this than I do, but there are physical treatments of the brain that don't require medication, but nevertheless can help mental illness. EMDR is one of them. Those of you who don't know what EMDR is, it's what's that? Eye movement desensitization. Yeah. Reprocessing. Yeah. And it's a strange kind of treatment, but it's the physiology behind it is sound. The research is pretty sound, at least from what I've read. Requires no medication, but your brain, you're physically, as you're talking through, issues in your past, you're physically doing something with your mind and your brain, and it actually allows the brain to relax. And the way that it was explained to me is that CBT, now again, correct me if I'm wrong, but CBT is targeting the front part of your brain. That's my caveman logic. The front part of your brain is where CBT therapy helps. The thought process is the logic that goes on in the front of the brain. But EMDR targets something in the back of the brain. The
emotional part of the brain. Yep.
Yeah. And so those are two different areas of the brain that both affect mental health. So we have this clear empirical research that's showing a strong relationship between the physical brain and the mind. Now, that doesn't mean that we can reduce all mental states to brain activity. That's the materialist paradigm, and we don't hold to that. And there's lots of evidence that that's not true anyways. So I'm not saying that, but there is a symbiotic relationship between the two. Yeah. So
I love that.
That's
good stuff, Tim.
Yeah. I've done my research. Research. Yeah. Solomon talks about EMDR. Yeah.
That's great.
So I don't have anything further to say on that. Maybe one point in closing. Do you have anything else to say?
I had a question for you.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. So my question for you is regarding this aspect of why do you think Christians don't want to accept the fact that there's this fallen part of the physical in like the mind and the body, right? The body itself is dying every day. It dies a little bit more. But for some reason, Christians throughout the years have just said, no, I want to deal with this in a spiritual way, right? I want to use scripture. This should heal. So really the question is, people often use the argument that because this person experienced something miraculous and it healed them, whether it be a medical concern or a mental health issue, why doesn't it happen to more people? Why don't more people get healed in the same way that others experience these miraculous healings in a sense, right? I don't feel like I worded that correctly. I guess my question is, people who have experienced healing from mental health, so say, I don't suffer with depression anymore. I don't suffer with anxiety, which I have heard. And they'll say, ever since I came to the Lord, like I didn't suffer with anxiety anymore. And then you have another group that says, well, I've been trying to trust God with this. I've been implementing scripture. I've been memorizing this verse. I've been having community. What's going on there? Because you see a shaming on one side to the other side. Yeah. You're not applying enough faith.
Yeah. Let's use an analogy with physical healing. Okay. Some people get healed physically, miraculously. There's accounts of that. You know, Craig Keener, he's a biblical scholar, theologian out at Asbury Seminary, wrote a 2-volume set on miracle accounts, both in the Bible and then modern day stuff. Physical healings happen miraculously. Does everyone get healed physically? No. Does anyone know why? No. I mean, this is one of Keener's points, is that we don't know. Like it's you can't say, well, it's the faith of the person or lack of faith, or it's the faith of the healer, you know, or not. He says things like, I don't know. You know, there seems to be there's a purpose behind it that God knows that we don't. So with physical healing, sometimes we have accounts of that where someone gets healed, another person doesn't. With mental health, it could be lots of different things. Like, there's different forms of cancer. There's different forms of diseases that hit the body, or there's different physical things that could happen, like accidents and whatnot. You know, in the mind, there could be all kinds of different reasons why someone is experiencing anxiety, depression, PTSD, other things like that. It may be, to kind of step into your world a little bit with God attachment, it may be that when, like that compensation theory, like when, I pay attention. Yeah. My mind is a sponge. So if someone is experiencing anxiety or depression or something like that, and they weren't raised in church and they come to the Lord, they see God as father figure as compensating for the things that they lacked. But if someone is raised in church and their anxiety, depression, PTSD, or some other thing that they're dealing with is related to maybe abuse that they experienced by their parent or a religious figure or something like that, that's strongly connected to their theological and religious beliefs, then they're going to struggle. Like that's going to be a harder struggle for them. There's a different road or path that maybe they need to take to find healing, that they're not going to find an immediate healing to that. You know, I've seen videos, people online where one guy in particular, you know, he said, yeah, I've prayed for years and years and years for God to heal me of depression. But then he had just come out of his first EMDR treatment. And he was like, and I'm praying that maybe this is the way that the Lord is going to bring healing into my life. So sometimes God like heals people physically in a miraculous way. Sometimes he uses doctors to do that. Like he gives us medicine and physicians. You know, I like what Dr. Heiser said on a video, not in one of his books, but in a talk he was giving, where he said, we really kind of downplay the way God works in the world. We say, oh God, we want to see you move, but God moves through his people, and he moves through image bearers on the earth. And so he gives us doctors to do medicine right, to heal people and things like that. So we can pray that the doctors have wisdom and skill and prudence to kind of see and counselors as well, mental health professionals, they can discern what the root causes are and know how to treat it. And that's a perfectly legitimate way to see God healing. So, you know, just to cap it off, you know, there were things in my life early on when I was a young man. I would just pray, Lord, fix this, please fix this, please heal this, please fix this. You know, I had to go through a process where the Lord, I think he opened doors, and I had to step through doors and show courage and hard work and other things to resolve those issues in my life. I won't disclose what those are on the show, but it's like he brought me through those things, but it was a process. It wasn't like I just woke up one day, I'm like, hey, I'm fixed.
Right.
Yeah. So, that's what I would say to people is like, if you're going through counseling, that doesn't mean that God's not healing you, that he might want you to go through that because there's something that you need to learn or discover or know, that if he just miraculously healed you, you wouldn't understand.
No, that's a good point. And, you know, to just kind of wrap that up as well, is that for those of you who maybe have experienced something like that, or maybe are thinking about going to counseling and can't because you're fighting off that, oh, you know, as a Christian, I shouldn't go to counseling. I should be fully dependent on God. And again, to Tim's point, God can use a counselor, he can use a medical doctor, he can use a person in your life that can help with that process, with that journey. But it doesn't mean that he's going to, that he's necessarily going to withhold a miracle from you. If he does it great. But that's not everyone's experience. I think we want to kind of remove the shame from those of us who haven't experienced healing after praying for something for such a long time and thinking that, oh, well, why did this person get blessed, or this person was healed from that, not me, and so on. And even when you go to counseling, this aspect of, well, I've been going to counseling for, X amount of time, I should be healed by now. Like there's that frustration too. I had a student come in one time and we're doing severe trauma background, and she wanted to get everything done in one semester. I'm like, yeah, that's probably not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, this is an ongoing process. It's going to take us a while. So, but I need to be ready by this date. I can't guarantee that. Like, that's just not an option here, And so thankfully we did some work and we're able to make some good progress, but still there's always ongoing work. So the Lord is working. The Lord can use people in your life to help deal with these things. These things are real, to counter MacArthur's point. They are real, but they're reminders of the fallenness of man, right? It's how others have hurt you and how you also in turn have responded to that hurt. All of that plays into it.
Yep. So in closing, I would say, I hope this episode is an example for people to see how you can disagree with someone you highly respect in an informed and clear way. I hope people take that from this episode, that we greatly respect John MacArthur, but we greatly disagree with him on this topic, and we have good reasons for doing so. All right.
All right. That's it. I'll see you next time, guys.